Today we've got a crazy revenge story of vandalizing a car. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, my brother sent me to prison for 4 years. I got my revenge when I got out. My brother, male 28, was deeply invested and addicted to the use and sake of some illegal substances, all without my knowledge. He sought my help when he was in a pinch, as I truly believed that he was in trouble. Little did I know what he had in store for me, as I would come to be the one to bear the consequences of his own actions. I, male 26, was paying the price for an act I had no hand in committing, until I decided not to anymore. It was all as a result of the actions of my very own brother. Now, you might be wondering why exactly I was referring to him as a family member, and just that, instead of my brother. Well, the thing is, if he truly was my brother, he wouldn't have done what he did to me and thought that he could get away with it all. Now let me take you back to the very beginning of my story, so as to ensure that you properly understand where exactly it was that I was coming from and how things turned out to be the way they were. My brother and I haven't always had the best relationship. In fact, we were pretty much at each other's necks at any given point in time, and this was due to the fact that we grew up being very competitive. We always had something to compete over, whether it was for gifts during Christmas while we were children or for the same girl back when we were both in high school. Bottom line was that we always had something to drag amongst ourselves. Our parents knew of this so-called rivalry of ours, and on most occasions had to intervene when things were getting out of hand. However, when we both got into college, they decided to leave us to our own vices. Now, I never hated my brother, and I was sure of some certain things that my brother was capable of, or so I thought. He was the older one, but this didn't really matter. We both graduated from high school at the exact same time, and got into college at the same time too. And I should also add that we both got into the same college studying a course under the same faculty. Our rivalry didn't stop when we both graduated valedictorian from our high school. We were both looking forward to life after high school, which was basically our college life, all while leaving all preparations for the unexpected. Now, our first year in college was really smooth. We transitioned as quickly as possible, all in an attempt to get a head start over the other. And it was fun in a way, as I could never have possibly imagined my life without this rivalry with my brother, and I always thought that he felt the same way. Little did I know that of all the people my brother knew, I was the only person that didn't know who he truly was, or rather, how he truly felt about me as his brother. In our second year in college, I was already beginning to notice some drastic changes in my brother's life, both academically and mentally. Now academically, because it was obvious in his grades. He was slipping, and it was obvious to everyone that knew him, but no one took it upon themselves to bring it to his attention. No one but myself. I tried on several occasions to get through to my brother, all to no avail. He was either never around, or he just didn't want to see me. When I eventually got a hold of him, I could tell that he wasn't mentally okay, physically too. He was already looking like someone that was on the brink of losing himself. He was staggering, he was pale looking, and his eyes had bags under them. Those bags one would get after several days of sleep deprivation. At this point, I wasn't even thinking again. I just took him straight to the nearest hospital and got him admitted. After several weeks had passed, he was finally back to his usual self. And that was when I asked what happened to him, and that was when he explained to me what he'd been going through. Apparently, he'd been finding it tough to keep up with me, both academically and as a rival. According to him, he barely managed to get past his first year in college, and he didn't believe that he could do it again the second time. When he was at his lowest, his friends introduced him to substance abuse and drinking. He thought of this as a coping mechanism, considering everything that was going on around him. He soon got addicted quicker than he possibly could have realized, and hence the reason he was in the state that I found him. I truly understood what he was going through at the time, and he made me promise not to tell our parents, as he believed that they would see him in a different light and that he couldn't handle it. I believed him and kept his secret. This was yet again another mistake that I made. Now after that day, I took him to the hospital, and he spent quite a few months at the hospital. I was always checking up on my brother just to make sure that he was doing okay, and also to assure him that I was there for him for anything that he needed, no exceptions. And I was beginning to see noticeable changes. He was soon back to the same person I once knew, and I was glad that things were gradually getting back to normal. Or so I thought. It wasn't long after he was discharged from the hospital that his so-called friends were keeping in contact with my brother. But this time they wanted him to work on distributing their product. His street smarts was what they said they wanted, when really what they wanted was someone they could easily manipulate. And it was so easy to get my brother to join them, as they only needed to show him their profit margins and what was in it for him. Now, how does all of this relate to me? Buckle up, because things are about to get really interesting. Now, seeing as my brother had gotten involved with the wrong crowd yet again and was hiding this fact from me, it was obvious that sooner rather than later that his actions would bear dire consequences for him. This on its own was an unavoidable fact, no matter how hard he tried to hide it, and surely enough, this happened sooner rather than later. Now, the incident that made me realize what my brother was involved in was one where he'd lost some packages he was meant to distribute. I don't know how they found out, but the people he was involved with found out that we were both brothers, and they approached me, hoping that they could find out his whereabouts. I had no clue what they were looking for my brother for, nor could I have believed that he was actually involved in whatever it was that they said he was involved in. And so, they were left with no other option but to rough me up for my brother to get the message. I was beaten up so bad that I passed out. I woke up and found myself in the hospital, and the person that brought me there was none other than my brother. I looked to him to explain himself when I was able to handle myself properly, and he basically just lied straight to my face, talking about he had a little misunderstanding with his friends and he never would have thought that they would take it to that extent. He basically avoided all attempts I made at confirming whether what they had told me was true or not. He assured me that whatever they told me he was into, he had no idea what they were talking about, and so I decided to trust him. It wasn't like they stopped when he cleared the air with them, as he had told me. Occasionally, they would pay me visits, keeping me in check, probably to make sure that my brother didn't get any funny ideas. This really affected my grades. I was no longer able to focus as I was supposed to. While all of this was going on, my brother, on the other hand, was thriving, and I had no idea how he was doing this. To cut the long story short, I wasn't able to keep my grades up and I had to drop out of college because it was just a little too much for me at this point. Now, my parents were most definitely not happy with this decision of mine, most especially my father, as he had thought to himself that of the both of us, that is my brother and I would be the one to truly make him proud. After I dropped out, I was nothing more than a total disappointment. My brother, on the other hand, was really praised and held to a much higher standard than I was back at home. After he had graduated, he even got a pretty decent job at a very respected and reputable company, while I could only barely get myself a job at a fast food restaurant. Basically, my whole life was just a series of unfortunate events. I would soon be kicked out of my own parents' home, as they both claimed that I was too much of a disappointment and they couldn't bear to see me every single day moving forward. I had to cater for myself. Now, while things weren't really going too well for me at this time, my brother was thriving, and the only thing that came to my mind at the time was the fact that we were still blood brothers regardless. He could have at least shown some compassion when I came to him for help. Unfortunately, that was not the case. So I went to my brother's home and I begged for his assistance. I was met with a blunt rejection. He was apparently blaming me for disappointing our parents and for putting myself in this situation. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I thought he probably was saying this because he'd forgotten why I was in this situation in the first place. But he soon made things clear to me that he had no hand in what I went through and that I was at fault for not standing up for myself. I left his place, filled with shame, guilt, and anger. After I left his place, I had a lot of time to think about what to do and what direction my life would take. And the only thing that I could think of was the downfall of my brother. And so, I sought every and any means to bring him down. I thought of ruining his work image and also the way our parents viewed him, and there was only one way I could have done that: his past records. Seeing as I was the one that stood by him throughout his rehabilitation process back in high school, I had records of his treatments and also records of payments. Once I'd gathered everything I needed, which honestly took more time than I'd thought of, all I needed to do was simply go through with my plan. However, before I did this, I decided to give him one more chance. I went by his place and pleaded with him one last time and asked that he think his next actions through before acting on it, but he was still adamant and demanded that I never come over to his place again. I was disappointed, but relieved in some way, as I knew that whatever happened from then onwards, I would be guilt-free. It didn't take long from when I took action till when I started to see results. He was fired from his place of work for hiding his previous medical history and his addiction. My parents were also very disappointed in him after finding out that he was heavily addicted for a while, and he was supported by none other than the disappointment. His entire life came crumbling down faster than he could even comprehend, and I was there to watch it all. I regret nothing, and if given a second chance, I would do it all over again. You know, the interesting thing here is OP phrased it in a way that said, hiding their previous medical history. Like, I just feel like most places, you can't even necessarily ask for a previous medical history unless it's like legitimately related to a situation that is going to prevent them from doing the current job. Like, if you only have one hand and you want to be a stenographer, it's not impossible, there's actually tools for that, but you're gonna have to mention it. If you have a stint in rehab and put your life back together and then go on to go and search for a job, do you have to report that? Also, hi, I'm Steven, and if you guys enjoy crazy stories of revenge, it would be amazing if you left a like or left a review if you're listening to my podcast. That said, our next story is The Time I Stole My Boss's Car. I still find it hard to believe there was a time in my life when I, 40-year-old male, got framed for a crime I didn't commit. This was back in 2010. I had just finished college and was drowning in student loans. I couldn't tell my parents the truth since I lied that I got my admission on scholarship. My parents were so proud to send their only son to a prestigious school in another country without having to pay a dime. Before anyone goes around blaming them for being so careless, keep in mind that I come from a country where education was considered a luxury at the time, and my parents were farmers who spent most of their lives tending to crops and rearing animals, so they knew very little about scholarships and what it entailed. I knew my parents couldn't afford to send me to my choice of college, so I decided to just lie to make things easier on them. They did their best to provide the money for my plane ticket. They had to sell a piece of land for that. That was how proud they were. So going back home with nothing after spending 5 years in a country like the US wasn't an option. I had just graduated from college, the job market was saturated and the competition was fierce. You needed a helping hand if you wanted to land a job, or at least someone on the inside, and I had none. The little money I made from all the part-time jobs I was using to pay my debt. I couldn't afford an apartment. I had to squat with friends who had themselves to sort out till I got to stay with Kurt. Kurt was a friend from college. We lived in the same dorm, although we were in different majors. He was cool. When he said he had a job proposition for me, I'd gotten my hopes up and expectations a little high, but it all shattered when he took me to the auto mechanic shop downtown, not so far away from college. He worked there for a while in college. Back then, I was unable to get a job there because the place was occupied. But now that the opportunity was here, I couldn't afford to say no. My boss, Maxwell, was an older, unenthusiastic man who only cared about how much you made per repair of each car. He paid us so little despite the load of work we did. That didn't make sense to me since we were the ones doing the labor. We ought to be getting more, but the other guys there said this was how Maxwell rolled, and if you weren't fine with it, you could always leave. These guys were college students and they seemed to be making a lot more than the pennies I was making, although it felt like something was at play and I was being left out of it. We were 4 in total working for Maxwell: Chris, Ethan, Tobias, and I. The guys always came in earlier than I did and would spend each day working on the parts of the cars that needed fixing before placing them into their original positions. They took turns doing this, even though I was always left out of it. They knew their way around cars, and I must admit they were good, but for some reason, I was never allowed to touch any part that had just been gotten or needed to be changed. For instance, a customer comes in with their car and says he has no idea what is wrong. As soon as they check it out and see what the problem is, they immediately talk about the changes they need to make and how much it costs, and the customer wires the money and leaves. Unlike them, I had to write down the deposit that was made, or if payment was made in full, then work on the car, and if the car required a change in engine or something more elaborate than servicing, I was to leave it for the other guys. This didn't make sense because I knew more than I was being restricted to, and the dynamics between my boss and the other guys was different from his and mine. At first I thought it was because I was new, then I thought it was because he didn't think I could do a good job, but I got to find out it was more than that. Some days we got busy and other days we didn't have so much to do, but on this particular day, there was a lot of work to be done. Normally I wasn't allowed to fix or take out anything from a car, but on this day, it was an all hands on deck kind of job. This was when I noticed something wasn't right with the car engine. It was different from the engine that had been removed, a bit older. I asked the guys what was going on, and Ethan flat out told me they were taking out the new engine and replacing it with an older one. They had a buyer they sold it to and made money off of it, and if I was interested, I could earn a lot more than I was being paid by Maxwell. That sounded incredibly reckless and foolish to me. They were risking people's lives based on what they were doing. Besides, taking out something new and replacing it with an older version wasn't right. I didn't want to snitch on anybody, but they had to have known the implications of what they were doing. This was a car we were talking about. One wrong move and someone could get into an accident. I wanted to pretend like it was none of my business, especially since I was sure this had been going on before I arrived, but I couldn't stand by and watch the guys do that. I get that they needed to make more money, but some lines shouldn't be crossed. The next day, I told them how I felt about what they were doing. I knew it probably wouldn't solve anything, but it was worth a trial. They all just laughed and said I was being too serious. They always made sure all the secondhand engines were fine and replicated to perfection. They even made sure to thoroughly check it out, and if they had any doubt, they tested it out before giving the car back to its owner. They said I was being too uptight and should loosen up. Not only has this been something that had been going on long before I joined them, but none of the customers have ever complained about their cars being faulty because those engines were that good. I wouldn't lie to you, I was tempted for a minute because they were right. Ever since I'd started working for Maxwell, I had never seen anyone come back with the same problem, nor had I seen anyone who once had this engine fixed at our shop and came back complaining about an issue with their engine. I was this close to telling them I was in, but I just couldn't. My options were limited. Either I quit or reported them to the authorities. I had made up my mind. I was going to leave after I got paid for the month. I just had to ignore them till I left. Unfortunately for me, that didn't go as planned because the month passed and I was still working at the auto repair shop because I wasn't affected in any way. I turned a blind eye to what the guys were doing and did whatever was required of me. The workload was little on me since I didn't participate in the hard stuff and I didn't make nearly as much as the other guys, but I was fine with it. It was better than nothing. I had no idea that there had been a fallout with some customers because I always got to work at noon. No one told me anything until one day when I randomly came to work and saw two strangers looking mad. I had no idea something was going on and went inside only to be stopped by my boss. He pointed at the cars parked at the front and asked if I was responsible for fixing it. I said no without hesitation because I had no idea, but then Ethan and Chris came in and immediately started spewing crap about how I was the one who fixed both cars and how incredibly sorry they were about the mess I made, and how I was new to the work and was bound to make mistakes. I was dumbfounded. Never in my life had I been falsely accused of doing something I didn't do, and it got even worse when Tobias arrived. These guys were vile people who wouldn't admit to making any mistake. It turned out the transmission fluid was leaking, and one of the guys forgot to check it out, causing the transmission to overheat. I felt so angry at myself for letting these guys make a fool of me. They were willing to just let me take the fall for their mistake. I hadn't gotten the chance to get over this incident when I found out I was being accused of swapping a new car engine with a second-hand engine. This was about 2 days after the first incident. I came to work wanting to speak with Maxwell about what the guys had been doing to other people's car engines, but they beat me to it. They were trying to cover their butts by pinning another blame on me because one of the two guys that came in the 2 days before found out his new car engine had been switched, and he wasn't taking it lightly. I had no idea someone came in the day before because Maxwell told me I needed time to get my crap together and I was given a week off, but I came in to talk to him about the guys only to find out they beat me to it. This wasn't a small accusation. This was something that had been going on for a while in Maxwell's shop, so I refused to believe he had no idea about it. He just chose to say nothing about it since they must have been giving him his share. I knew I was being set up and I had no evidence to back up my story because Maxwell was too selfish to install some cameras in his shop. I also knew I was out of a job by now. Nothing I could tell anyone could redeem me. But then the car owner wanted to sue me for fraud, and this was at a time when I had nothing. If I was found guilty, I knew I would have to recompensate him for his car and I had no money. I never expected things to get this far. I pleaded with the client, but he wasn't going to let it go. He said I should be jailed for what I did, and he was going to make sure he sued me for every penny I made. I knew I had to do something. I went to the auto repair shop and begged Maxwell to get me out of this mess. After all, it was his client. He could work out something with him and get him to drop the charges being made against me, but Maxwell refused to help me. He said it was going to cost him money he didn't have. I told him I was innocent and he knew that, and his response was that I was foolish enough to let myself get blamed for a crime I didn't commit, so I had to pay the price. I was so mad at him. I noticed his brand new car was parked outside, and then the vicious idea began to set in. I borrowed Kurt's car and tailed Maxwell to his home. He parked his car by the side of the apartment he lived at. From what I heard, his wife divorced him after she caught him cheating on multiple occasions. I knew what I was after. I just had to be smart about it, and working at an auto repair shop taught me a thing or two on how to unlock a car and start it without having access to the keys. I had no idea what came over me, but I knew I couldn't afford to get caught, so I was extremely careful. I entered the car through the passenger seat so I wouldn't be seen on camera and took his car. Thanks to the guys, I knew where to sell car parts. I dismantled Maxwell's car and sold his parts. I knew I could have just sold the car, but I didn't want to get caught, especially with the case I had on the ground. I got enough money to pay off the client that was suing me. Turns out the guy was looking to make some money and I gave him exactly what he needed, so he dropped the case. And I used the spare change to get myself an apartment. As for the guys, I left them to be. I heard from Kurt some months later that Maxwell got the police involved in his car case, and while they found nothing to work with, they noticed some illegal activities were going on at the shop. Turns out the guys not only sold spare parts, but also sold coke. I didn't know about that. They got caught and were sent to jail, and the shop had been closed down for further investigation. I just think for OP's sake that they should be glad they weren't a little bit more organized with this whole organization thing they got going on. I mean, I feel like if Maxwell had some real savvy business sense and was really running this backdoor organization well, there'd be some extra fear motivation to not want to double cross them in some form, whether it's some kind of fear enforcing things they're propping up themselves or just the connections they have. I don't know, maybe I'm just going too far off of the movie or fanfic deep end side of things. Our next story is, I vandalized my half-sister's car. My parents should have never have gotten married, but my mom was head over heels in love with my dad, and she managed to make her father, my granddad, marry her. My dad cheated on his then girlfriend, my stepmother, and got my mom pregnant even though he was in love with my stepmother. And my grandfather insisted that my dad had to make an honest woman out of her. Dad, being the gentleman, agreed to marry my mom, but one thing was clear, he didn't love her. Unlike many other stories I'd heard where the man is forced to be a husband and dad, my dad had no resentment towards me for having to marry my mother. My mother, on the other hand, deeply resented me. She hated that despite having a baby with my father, whom she knew loved children and was certain that having a baby by him would make him love her, she still wasn't able to get him to love her. When I was barely 2, my mother divorced my dad and took me with her. Shortly after their separation, my dad began dating my stepmother again and had a baby with her too. At this time, my parents were in a bitter custody battle. My mom didn't exactly want me, but she needed to use me to get back at my dad for not loving her back. After a long back and forth, my parents got joint custody of me. My mother, as the primary guardian, made it hard for my dad to enjoy his custody of me. She would ask him to come pick me up and then never open the door when he knocked. My dad was frustrated and was already considering going to court yet again when my mother met someone. She fell in love with him and wanted to go with him to his home country. Since she couldn't take me along, she let me be with my dad. That was how I got to grow up with my dad and his new family. My stepmother has 2 kids. One was a total sweetheart, and the other one, Ella, was the complete opposite of her brother. I'm 3 years older than Ella, but because I was a year behind in school, I got picked on by my little half-sister. Ella was super manipulative and would turn on her charm when she needed it and throw a huge tantrum when she thought that was the best method to get whatever it was that she wanted from our dad. My dad always knew she was a troublemaker and would never take her side against me, but she would cry and tell my dad that he didn't really love her and that he preferred me to her. My dad never gave in to her manipulative tactics, but at some point, I started to notice my dad trying to make certain adjustments to accommodate her. For instance, my dad would punish her whenever she got into trouble, which was often, but whenever I did something bad, which was quite honestly rarely, my dad would enforce overly strict punishment and make a show of punishing me so that he wouldn't come off as partial to his wife and daughter. When I became a teenager, my half-sister suddenly became a monster to me. She had always been mean to me, but suddenly it all got a lot worse. My stepmother was very pretty, but my half-sister looked nothing like her. I, on the other hand, had my mom's body, pretty face, and cheekbones that stood out. Everyone complimented me, both at home and at school. Ella wasn't that pretty, but she was popular. Everyone knew her in school because she was everywhere and friends with some popular girls in school. Ella hated me, and I know it because she was jealous of me for being prettier than she was. She could be in the house having a good day, but then we would have a guest come in and comment on how beautiful I was becoming, and that would ruin Ella's day. Anyway, after I turned 16, Ella went into full-blown evil mode. She started to do weird stuff like sneak into my room and throw my makeup from my bedroom window. My mom worked for a makeup brand. She always sent me makeup, and so I always had enough, but it was annoying having to deal with my makeup being thrown out every other month. I reported her numerous times to my dad and stepmom. At first, they would punish her and make her apologize to me, but with time, I think they got tired of punishing her. They started telling me to deal with it and that I would after all soon be off to college, or they would assure me that she would outgrow it. She was bullying me right in the face of everyone, and they refused to do anything about it. The only person who stood up to her, and for me, was my little half-brother, but he could only do so much anyway. Whenever anyone spoke to her about her attitude towards me, she would accuse them of hating her and not liking her because she didn't look like me. My dad and stepmother were tiptoeing around her feelings because they didn't want her to feel bad about how she looked, but no one cared about how her behavior made me feel. Things got worse when I had my first boyfriend. One day he was visiting and my stepmom insisted on him staying for dinner. My half-sister started to tell embarrassing stories about me at the table. It wasn't even the stories that embarrassed me, it was her trying very hard to put me down in front of my boyfriend that was too embarrassing. And guess what? The adults at the table did nothing. They just tried to laugh it off and pass off her stories as a joke, even though I could tell that they were just as severely embarrassed. I wasn't worried that her embarrassing behavior could negatively impact my relationship, but I was mad that her parents had made it okay for her to disrespect me so openly and get away with it. It was even worse at school. Once, she and her friends placed a banana peel just on the floor in front of my locker to watch me step on it and fall. Thankfully, a janitor saw it before I did and warned me to watch out. I watched as my half-sister and her friends frowned in disappointment when I didn't step into their trap. The last straw for me was when my mom sent me a gorgeous dress for prom, and it suddenly disappeared from my closet on the day before prom night. I was going to show my dress to my best friend when I noticed that it was missing. I was sure that my half-sister took it, but she insisted that she did not. I cried so much that day that I became very sick. Still, my evil half-sister didn't admit to taking the dress. The next morning, while I was in bed with my best friend by my side, consoling me, my stepmother went to the mall and helped me buy a new dress. The dress she got fit perfectly, but I didn't like it. It wasn't as close to being stylish as the one my mom sent, and the color wasn't flattering on my skin. I had to wear a dress like that for prom, but I didn't enjoy myself in the event as much as I had envisaged. If I had worn the dress my mother sent, I would have been the star of the event, but with the new dress, I didn't stand out at all. Shortly after prom, my little half-brother found the dress in the pile of clothes that we were going to give to charity. I'm sure my half-sister had hidden the dress and those clothes in the garage and thought no one would look through the clothes. Even after finding the clothes, my half-sister denied ever taking it and insisted that I must have mistakenly put it there. But no way could it even happen. At the time, I had just been accepted for a short pre-college program, so I was too excited to care too much about the prom dress, especially since prom was over anyway. Before I left for school, my half-sister admitted to me in an argument that she hid my prom dress. She wasn't sorry, and yes, I told our parents, but as usual, they chalked it up to her being immature and dismissed my feelings. 2 years later, I was home for the spring break. My half-sister was still as spoiled and annoying, but she mostly stayed out of my way. She was way too obsessed with boys anyway. My dad had promised to buy her a car when she clocked 16. He kept his promise and got her a nice car painted pink because pink was her favorite color. My half-sister was thrilled. She bragged about how the car would bring her closer to the it girls in school. She was friends with some of them, but they dumped her when they got into high school, and she would get to hang out and date one of the popular guys in school when the break was over. Unfortunately for my half-sister, I had other plans. I paid some guys I used to know in high school to come to our house, vandalize her car, and spray it a hideous shade of gray. I gave them the key to our garage and they came in late at night, snuck into our garage, and destroyed several parts of the car. They then spray painted it gray. It was all rushed since they had to hurry and leave before anyone woke up, so the painting wasn't perfect paint. It was pink with dull, ugly patches of gray all over it, the very opposite of beautiful. The next morning, my half-sister came into the living room screaming that her car had been vandalized. My dad rolled his eyes and ignored her, but her mom and brother went with her to the garage to see what happened. Ella started to cry and told everyone that I did it, but no one believed her. Or maybe they did, but they were already sick of her BS. Or they thought she deserved it, but I'm sure they heavily suspected me anyway. I mean, it was too smooth for it not to have been planned by someone who lived in the house with them. Also, my dad refused to report to the police. He was probably scared that they would figure out I did it, and that would earn me a criminal record. That car sat in the garage for months. My dad and her mom didn't fix it until months later. That was how I got back at my half-sister Ella for years of tormenting me. I think it's pretty clear by the dad deliberately choosing not to get the police involved that they had to have known that OP was involved. Like, although the parents clearly were a major part of the problem the whole time, at least in that situation, they did kind of have OP's back, right? But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another absolutely crazy revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.